We're getting today to James chapter 3, the second half of James chapter 3. I'm excited about this. What I'm excited about is if you've been going through the past 8 weeks with us, what you know about James is that James is all about wisdom. Now, wisdom is not knowledge. Knowledge and wisdom are completely different. Knowledge is I know a lot of things, and maybe you have degrees and you're educated, but that's completely different. Wisdom is knowledge applied. It's that I take the things that I know that are true in my life, and I am able to apply them to my life in a practical way. And James is the book of wisdom in the New Testament. And what he's now going to say is he's going to say, I want you to apply wisdom to your personal relationships. And as we've been going through our series and closer, James is going to talk about how can I have closer relationships with the people in my life. And so he starts out by saying in James 3:13, who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. If you want to say that you're wise, let me see your life. Let me see your relationships. Let me see the character that you're exhibiting on a regular basis. And so he's going to give us a prescription for how to have closer relationships. But I love James because he's totally straightforward. James doesn't sugarcoat anything, and he gets right to the heart of the matter, and he gives us the problem as to why we don't have close relationships. He gives us the problem as to why we have conflict in our lives and why there's a disconnect in the relationships and the people that we care about. And so he says there's really two things that are going on here in James chapter 3, verses 14 through 16. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every evil practice. And so he's saying that you can trace back a disconnect from people, a disconnect in relationships. You can trace it back to envy and selfish ambition. And you know what I love about the Bible? Is that it is as relevant or more relevant today than it was written 2,000 years ago. That the things that James is talking about are things that people struggled with 2,000 years ago. But guess what? We have this thing in our lives called our sinful nature. It's called the flesh, and we wrestle with it every single day. And he's saying the flesh, the selfish ambition gets in the way to us experiencing intimacy with the people that we care about the most. And so what he says, I'm going to drop down to verse 18 in James chapter 3. He says this, peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. So he's going, okay, imagine your relationships and you're like a farmer and you're sowing various things. Now, if you're sowing envy and you're sowing selfish ambition and you're sowing anger, what are you going to reap? You're going to reap conflict, broken relationships, and all of this negative stuff. Now, he says, but if you're going to sow peace, mercy, grace, if you sow love into those relationships, you're going to experience righteousness in those relationships, and you're going to have strong, healthy connections. And so what I love is that he's going to give us a prescription in verse 17 to how to have closeness, how to have those bonded, strong relationships that all of us desire. Think back to the garden. When God created Adam, and then he created all the animals there, and Adam's naming all the animals, and God said, it is not good for man to be alone. It's not good for anyone to be alone. And when we feel disconnected from other people, there's a deep sense of loneliness in our hearts. And so James is going to say, hey, let me give you some practical advice. Better advice than you'll ever get in any magazine article, or you can Google, how do I have better relationships? And I'm going to tell you, it might as well just land on James chapter 3, because you're not going to get any better advice on how to have strong relationships. And so let's move right into the first one. And the first one is this: to have strong relationships, be pure. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure. So pure here doesn't necessarily mean just sexual purity, although it includes it. What it means is to be honest, to deal with people fairly, that there's a purity. People can see in your life and they go, wow, that's somebody that I can put my trust in. Somebody that's not going to go and gossip about me. Someone that's not going to try to cheat or steal or try to manipulate me in some way. It's someone that I can trust. In fact, if we were doing Family Feud, I always love watching that show. They always ask the question, if I were to ask you the question, what is the strongest, probably the number one thing that creates closeness in relationships? I said, what was that one virtue? What would you say? Probably honesty and trust, right? Most of us would say that if a relationship is not built on honesty and trust, it's automatically going to break down. And so James starts out with this idea of purity. Now, purity is very similar to integrity. Integrity. And as we move into, James is kind of that book that is attributed to wisdom in the New Testament, that we can connect with the Old Testament. I love how the New Testament connects with the New Testament, because the Old Testament book of wisdom is Proverbs. And so for each of these points, I'm attaching a proverb to it to show the connection between the New Testament, what James says, but also what God has said throughout the years and throughout his word in the Old Testament. And so look at this verse in Proverbs chapter 10, verse 9. Whoever walks in integrity walks securely. So when you're in a relationship, when someone's walking with integrity, there's security. You feel safe with that person. You feel emotionally safe with that person. And so if you're always being honest with that person, the next thing you know, they're going to be able to trust you. I love what Mark Twain said. He said, don't lie. That way you don't have to remember what you said. Isn't that true? Like if someone lies or someone tries to manipulate or someone says something over here but then changes the story over here, they're always in this state of insecurity, and then the other people are in a state of insecurity because they're going like, is that true? Is that what he's saying actually true? No. Build your life on the truth, Number 2, James says, be peaceable. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving. This is where you're not always looking for a fight. You're not always looking to contradict the other person, or you just kind of like, you're antagonistic. Yeah, I just have to be honest. When my emotional tank is depleted and I get exhausted, there are moments when I find myself just wanting to pick a fight, like an argument. And sometimes on Monday mornings, so I'm pouring myself out on the weekends, and I'm having a great weekend. And for some reason, I just wake up in the morning on Monday mornings, and I just have this negative attitude. And so my wife and I, we usually have this time together where we're sitting in our chairs and we're having our cup of coffee, and I could just find myself wanting to pick a fight. Does anybody ever do this? Okay, I guess I'm the only one. And it's so funny because she'll call me on it. She's like, you're just really kind of like wanting to like get in an argument and she's just kind of like laughing, like, what are you even doing here? Because there's just something broken inside of us that we kind of gravitate towards chaos, and we gravitate towards conflict. And what he's saying is, no, be peaceable in your relationships. In fact, Proverbs 23 says, avoiding a fight is a mark of honor. Only fools insist on quarreling. And so here's some ways that you can avoid quarreling. The first one is, in your relationships, don't compare. And that's gonna cause a fight more than anything. Oh, you're just like your father. You're just like your mother. Oh, why can't you be more like your brother? Or why can't you be more like your sister? He always does this. And so we compare ourselves, and that will create conflict like no other. Another thing that we don't want to do is we don't want to condemn in our relationships. How many of you have ever heard from someone, oh, you never do this, or you always do this? That's just a rule in relationships. Don't ever say never, and don't say, I just said never to say never, so I just broke the rule. But don't ever say, you always. Condemnation. You should do this. You shouldn't do this. And we experience these guilt beatings from people in our life. And so when we feel that condemnation, it creates conflict. Maybe you just contradict what other people say. You're always defensive. You're always kind of like saying, oh, no, it's not that. And you just kind of have this attitude about you, and you're always looking for a fight. Be peaceable. I love this passage in Proverbs, this next one. When people's lives please the Lord, even their enemies are at peace with them. That as a follower of Jesus Christ, that your life is marked by peace. And there's an agreeability. Now that's not to say that you don't disagree about the injustices that we see. And if you see something, character flaws in people's lives that are constant, and you see them going down a road that's going to be dangerous, obviously there's a time to confront. There's a time to lovingly speak the truth in someone's life. But overall, there's times when we just don't have to say anything at all. So be peaceable. The third thing that James says to have closeness in relationships is be considerate. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, and then considerate. Considerate. I love this 2,000 years ago, and nothing has changed here. If we are more considerate in our relationships, they'll be stronger, more intimate, more bonded. What do I mean by consideration? I mean this is that you're taking into account the other person's feelings. That some people just have this attitude of like, I'm just going to speak the truth because it's the truth, and so I can just say whatever I want to say. And that's actually not always the best plan. Because sometimes you're speaking the truth, but it's really not going to help the situation. So what you have to do is go, is what I'm going to say right now going to help the situation? You know, there's a thing so we have these brains that God has given us. And there's a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And that's the executive functioning of your brain. And it's the filter, right? So there's things that come through your brain all the time. And maybe you're in relationships or you get angry. And there's things that you're like, oh, I'm about to say it, but I'm not going to say it because I know this is not wise for me to say this at this point. And so God has given us this prefrontal cortex for us to filter the words and the things that we say to each other. In fact, I love that Proverbs says it best. The words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. And so we have the ability to be reckless with our words and to pierce and to hurt people. Or we have the words, or we have the ability to be able to speak words of truth and life, that we can be considerate and think about others. And so I also love the fact that the prefrontal cortex, that part of our brains, that's the part of our brains where we have empathy and we have compassion. That's the part of our brains where we have consideration for others and we're thinking about others sometimes above ourselves. You know, it's interesting in a day and age when we live in a day and age of social media. Now, this is what consideration would look like on social media. I think it's nice that people go to parties and they have friends and they do these various things. And I think it's very unintentional, but what happens is that when they post something and they tag a group of people, and then that goes through a news feed. And then you have other friends that see that news feed and they go, I thought I would have been invited to that party. This probably has happened to you before. I thought I was part of that friend group. And what happens is that there's kind of this inconsideration and the person feels hurt. You know, we've taught our kids from a very young age that if you're invited to a party and you're then maybe with a group of friends or another friend the next day, don't talk about that party with the person that didn't get invited. It's all you're doing is you're just protecting that person's feelings and just being considerate with them. That's all you're doing. And so James is talking about being considerate. So just be considerate. Number 4 is be teachable. Be teachable. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is, first of all, pure, then peace-loving, considerate, and submissive. In the original language, this literally means to be open to reason. Not to be defensive, but it's be willing to learn and to be teachable. The opposite of this would be someone who's a know-it-all. And I'm sure that you don't have any know-it-alls in your life. But maybe you've come across somebody that every time you want to share something, they have a better story, more grandiose way that they did it, and they want to always add to what you already said. And you just kind of go, wow, you already know everything already, so there's really no need for me. And what that know-it-all does, and sometimes people do that out of insecurity, right? We want people to like us, and we want people to know that we're smart and stuff. And so we kind of put this wall up. But what James is saying is that, you know what? If you want to have closeness in relationships, you're willing to take the humble position of, I can learn from you. In fact, in Proverbs chapter 12, verse 15, it says, the way of fools that seems right to them, but the wise listen to advice. Now, obviously, you want to filter the things that you're learning, because some people are communicating ideas that are contradictory to your faith. But in general, that there's always something that you can learn from someone else. I read a book one time, and it said, aspire to be the dumbest person in the room. And I was like, I can do that. And what they meant is this: surround yourself with people who know more than you, who are smarter, who've lived life a little bit longer, so that you are teachable, that you're always growing. I was thinking about Solomon in the Old Testament, who wrote the book of Proverbs. And God comes to him and says, hey, Solomon, what do you want? And Solomon says, I need wisdom to administer justice as I lead your people. And God was pleased with that answer, and God gave him wisdom, and he gave him everything else as well. But what happened later on in Solomon's life is, as he gained all of this wisdom, what he did is he stopped learning. He stopped being teachable, and he stopped applying the things that he knew in his brain. And as a result of that, he had broken relationships, and he disobeyed God. And so we hold the humble position of being teachable. Number 5, James says, if you want to have more intimate, bonded relationships in your life, then be merciful. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is, first of all, pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit. And this is when you're able to not give what that person deserves. When they make a mistake and you withhold the judgment or the punishment that they deserve, that's what mercy is called. In fact, that's the mercy of God when God sends his son Jesus to come to this earth. All of us are separated from God for an eternity because of the sin in our lives. And so as a result of that, we deserve punishment. But what God does is he sends his son Jesus Christ to take upon the punishment that we deserve, so that now we don't experience punishment. We experience his love and his grace, and we get to spend eternity with him. Now, if we understand that truth, isn't that going to be deep down in our souls, so that when we interact with people and we interact with our husband or our wife or our coworkers, that's going to just come through us because we are so full of God's mercy, we then are going to be able to experience mercy. Jesus said, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. And so let your life and let your relationships be characterized by mercy. I remember one time out on Saturday night, I came home from the Saturday night service, and I had preached, and I was just exhausted. And in our house, if the lever is locked on our dishwasher, it means the dishes are clean. And I can't tell you how many times I've walked by and I've seen that little lever and I'm going, the dishes are clean, but I hope someone else does it. But this night, I was going to actually unload the dishes. I was exhausted. In fact, I opened up that lever and I started taking out the plates. And as I'm putting those plates, and I got to tell you, each plate felt like 20 pounds because I just was super unmotivated to do this. But sometimes you just have to put one foot in front of the other. I get to like 3/4 of the way of unloading the dishwasher. And I look at this cup and it's got like a film in it. I'm like, because when you unload the dishwasher, you kind of like wash off the plates and stuff. You don't put it in there dirty. And I'm going, wait a second, that looks kind of dirty. And then I go and I start looking at some of the plates. I go, wait, there's like a film there. I didn't know. And I start saying out loud, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. And my son can hear me and he says, Dad, what's wrong? And I said, I can't talk about it right now. I just can't talk about it. And I'm like overwhelmed. You're kind of thinking, I'm exaggerating. No, I was at the end of the day. I was so exhausted. And I am now thinking in my head, I'm going to have to go through my cupboards, take out every single glass, every single plate, and go and rewash this stuff. It's going to take 2 loads. And so I'm just overwhelmed in my head. And so I go upstairs where my wife is. And I walk up there really gently and nicely. And I said, hey, hon, did you wash the dishes? Because obviously when you lock it, that's telling me that it's washed. And she said, oh yeah, I did wash the... Oh, when I turned the lever, I got distracted. Somebody called and I forgot to actually turn it on. And because I'm so merciful, I said, are you kidding me? I was so upset. I was not using my prefrontal cortex at that moment. And I'm going, I can't believe this just happened. And so then I realized that I was going to be preaching the next day. And I'm like, oh man, I can't be like this hypocrite and tell people to be merciful. And so I actually was like, okay, I'm sure I've done that before. It could have happened to anyone, but I am struggling with this tug of war in my heart because everything in me wants to just let her have it. Have you ever been in that state? Have you ever been in a relationship where you're just like, oh, this mistake, you know what it cost me, so now I'm going to let you have it. And that's a natural thing. It's going back to what James says in James chapter 3, verse 13, that we are full of envy and selfish ambition. And so that stuff starts to rise up in us. And James is saying, don't let it rise up. Let mercy triumph over judgment. Let mercy triumph over justice. Let mercy triumph in your relationships. If you want to have intimate, strong relationships, I think this is one of the biggest ones right here. Because if we can lay down some of the disappointments that we have in other people, and we can look to God and say, you know what? My husband, my wife, my coworker, my boss, they were never meant to meet the need that only Jesus Christ can meet in my heart. And so I'm gonna give mercy instead of judgment. Look at this proverb here. Love prospers when a fault is forgiven, but dwelling on it separates close friends. Remember, we're talking about closeness in relationships. You dwell on something and you're going to experience disconnect. Number 6, James says this, be sincere. He says impartial and sincere. Look at this verse here. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving. I feel like I'm caught up here. Oh my goodness, I was going to take the whole stage with me. He gets to impartial and sincere. Now those 2 Greek words kind of sound like each other. And really what it means is to be without hypocrisy. Now in Greek theater, oftentimes there would be a play and there would be 2 or 3 actors that would play 4 or 5 different parts. And so the actor would come out and they would wear a mask and they would play a part in the play. Then they would go backstage, they would switch masks, and they would come out with a different mask and play a completely different part. And so they were called hypocrites because they were wearing masks. So that's why when Jesus describes the Pharisees, he's talking to them, he says, you guys are hypocrites because what you're doing is that you're wearing this mask and trying to fool all these people that you're so spiritual. But he goes, I know your hearts. You're full of selfish ambition and envy, going back to James. And so he goes, you know what? If you want to have close relationships, you begin to remove the mask. And I believe many of us, we wear masks because we think this: if you really knew what was in my heart, if you really knew how broken I was, you wouldn't accept me. And so it's a coping mechanism. It's a natural response in relationship for us to put up masks. And we think that it's going to bring us closeness, but it actually separates us. I remember I was talking to a good friend one time, and I was sharing my heart, and I was being transparent. And as I was doing this, I felt just a little weird, and I said, you know what? I'm actually embarrassed to tell you this. And he looked at me and he said, you know what? As you were sharing that, I felt closer to you. And it seems very counterintuitive, right? To be able to be transparent with someone, but when you begin to open your heart with someone, what happens is that they see and you're able to connect. We impress people with our strengths, but we connect with people in our weakness. And if we could develop that kind of culture, and we've been for the past 5 years developing that kind of culture at the Bridge, where we can say, hey, check your mask at the door. Let's come in and be real and honest. If I could be real and honest with you as a pastor, the very things that James is talking about, selfish ambition and envy, I struggle with it almost a daily basis. That as I go before the Lord, there's been moments, and some days are harder than others, but days where I just say, God, I'm just struggling with selfishness tonight. I just want to do things my way. And I'm honest with him. And you know what? I just always picture myself going, okay, Lord, I'm laying that down at your cross. God, I'm giving it to you because I'm not strong enough. By nature, I want to do things my way. And it just never goes well. And so you just get honest with people and you're transparent. Now, listen, when I talk about being transparent with people, I want you to be wise in that. That transparency happens over a period of time with someone that has built your trust, and vice versa. That when you're able to build this strong bond, that you're able to share a little bit more. But I'm going to tell you the most loving, healing, hopeful, encouraging relationships that I have been in are the ones that I go, I feel safe here and I can share my heart and I can take off my mask. And so be sincere if you want to have close relationships. Now, I love how we started this off, that if you sow in peace, you'll gain a harvest of righteousness. And I'm thinking about this idea. We all desire peace and intimacy and connection in our relationships. But one of the things, probably the most important thing about this idea of relationships is that I believe that we need, first of all, a relationship with God before we can have strong, healthy relationships with others. That, like I talked about, that need in our hearts for Jesus Christ, that He can only fill. So we can experience peace with God the Father because of Jesus Christ. In fact, the Bible says before Jesus and before us understanding His grace, we were enemies to God. But because of Jesus, now He has brought us close to God, and now we can experience peace. And once we experience that peace, now we can have healthy relationships. So it starts with Jesus, who is the embodiment of wisdom, and He is the embodiment of peace, and He is the embodiment of hope in our lives. And so He's the best relationship expert, isn't He? Jesus Christ. And here through James, we see some really practical things that we can implement every single day into those friendships and connections in our lives. So let's go to the Prince of Peace and to the strength to be able to gain that wisdom. Lord, thank you for this practical advice in James chapter 3, God. You've given us such wisdom to be able to know how we can have close relationships. God, we praise you, Lord, but we also admit to you that we've got areas of our lives where we still struggle with jealousy. We still struggle with envy. We struggle with selfish ambitions and wanting to do things our way. And so we just lay that down at your feet, Jesus. We thank you that you died on the cross and that your blood covers over those things in our heart. God, we know that you are alone powerful enough to remove those things. So on a daily basis, as those things begin to rise up in our hearts, God, we would bring them before you. God, we need your strength. We need your strength to be able to be merciful, Lord, to be considerate, to be pure, to be merciful and to be just loving towards the people in our lives. And so, God, would you give us the strength to do that? And I want to pray for anyone right now, Lord, maybe they've never come into a relationship with you. That closeness in relationship doesn't come by trying harder. It comes by believing and trusting what you did for us on the cross. And so, Lord, for that person that's never put their faith in you, they just say, Jesus, I need you. I want you in my life. I put my faith and trust in you. That everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. And so we just in our hearts call upon you and we say, we need you, Jesus. You are the King of our hearts. It's in your name we pray. Amen.